So part of this stemmed from a presentation I gave at Great Falls at the National Historic Trail Interpretive Center when they commemorated their 25th anniversary in 2023. And I talked a little bit about Lewis and Clark's connections to the fur trade. So this lecture today is kind of a part two to pick up where I left that story off. And we also whet your appetite if you received the We Proceeded On. You read in the November issue Jim Hardy's great essay on the impact of Lewis and Clark's experience on the fur trade, and I commend that to you. It was very well done. Of course, what we're talking about in the fur trade involved men and women around the world. These are a few examples of the things that were used in fashion in the United States at the turn of the 19th century. You see everything from gentlemen's hats and military hats and everyday wear hats to women's scarves and stoles and mufflers and all kinds of fancy gear. And so we're basically looking at that beaver pelt, which is up in the top right corner. That's one that's stretched, and it's roughly a full-size beaver, which they're nearly round when they're full size. And a full-size beaver weighs roughly 1.65 pounds. So keep that in mind when we start talking about pounds and prices and all those different things. If William Ashley's paying $3 per pound and a beaver pelt is 1.5 pounds, then they're roughly making about $5 a pelt. So you can kind of just keep that in the back of your mind. I wanted to just give a brief taste, though, that William Clark's first commercial venture was in 1798. And Joanne Trogdon's excellent book on the unknown travels and dubious pursuits of William Clark talk about how he turned these deer skins and beaver skins and otter skins and even some bacon into silver dollars by trading them down at New Orleans. So even before he gets involved in the Lewis and Clark expedition, he's trading beaver skins. Of course, the Louisiana Purchase was this doubling of the size of the United States, 828,000 square miles. And in addition to that, Jefferson's instructions to Lewis said, "The object of your mission is to explore the Missouri River for the purposes of commerce." And what he meant by that was the fur trade, both the beaver trade and the sea otter trade. When Lewis and Clark are preparing for their expedition, they get a lot of their merchandise from people already involved in the Missouri fur trade. These include the Frenchmen Auguste and Pierre Chouteau, and also Manuel de Lisa, all of whom were merchants that were plying the streams of Missouri before the expedition occurs. And a lot of the manpower to man the Red Perot and also the barge include French voyageurs, including some that are listed here, as well as some of the best hunters and woodsmen. And many of these French voyageurs, hunters, and woodsmen will continue in the fur trade after the expedition is over. At Fort Mandan, one of the most significant individuals that the party meets was a family led by Toussaint Charbonneau and some of his 4 wives, including Sacagawea. Toussaint Charbonneau was an employee of the Northwest Fur Company. This was a fur company based out of Montreal. It mostly dealt with the fur trade in the East, as well as in parts of what became the United States, and also the Pacific Northwest. The Great Middle was controlled by a company called the Hudson's Bay Company, which controlled all of the streams flowing into Hudson's Bay. And so those are the 2 great Canadian fur companies, and we meet one of those with this group. By the time they reach the coast, they're still interested in furs. And you remember Sacagawea barters the wonderful strands of blue beads that William Clark had gifted her for an exquisite otter robe that the captains desperately wanted as a sample. And so in just a few examples of these winter establishments, we see the role of the fur trade in those. And on the return journey, John Coulter receives permission to leave the expedition to join some trappers that are heading upstream up the Yellowstone River. And Coulter, in essence, will become one of the first year-round mountaineers or mountain men by many estimations. When they return to St. Louis, the letters that Lewis and Clark write to Jefferson and to Clark's brother use this language, that the Missouri River and its branches abound more in beaver than any other streams on earth. Now, you don't have to be very interested in the fur trade to know that that's pretty strong language to say that there's more beaver here than anywhere in the world. And certainly the news of that's published in the newspapers, and especially like wildfire in St. Louis, is going to create quite a stir. Moreover, Clark's letter to his brother Jonathan says, I consider this tract of the continent of immense advantage to the fur trade, as all of the furs collected in 9/10 of the most valuable fur country in America can be conveyed to the mouth of the Columbia and then to Asia, faster than they can get to Montreal or Great Britain. So basically, Clark is informing the nation that the primary objective of President Jefferson to find a commercial route for the fur trade is possible through the Lewis and Clark's experience. And you can imagine that in the spring of 1807, there were lots of people racing up the Missouri to see if these words were true. Many of these included Lewis and Clark veterans, many of whom joined Manuel Lisa on his expedition in 1807. And he gets out first. He eventually will also have Coulter join him on the upper Missouri. Lisa and his partner, Andrew Henry, is going to play an important role in the Rendezvous Era, construct a series of forts. And in particular, I want you to look at the ones that are on the upper Missouri and the upper Yellowstone rivers, including Manuel's Fort, or Fort Lisa, in 1807 at the confluence of the Yellowstone and Bighorn, and Henry's forts over on the Snake River and on the Three Forks of the Missouri. Now, you can see how strategic all three of these locations were and what prime real estate Lisa and Henry set up shop just a year after the Lewis and Clark expedition. Another group was led by Pierre Chouteau and Nathaniel Pryor, another expedition member, to escort Chief Sheheke and his wife Yellowcorn back to the Mandans. Unfortunately, they were stopped by the Arikara. Joseph Field was killed, and George Shannon had his left leg amputated as a result of the wound he received. So their expedition did not fare as well as Lisa's party. Meanwhile, William Clark and Meriwether Lewis have new jobs in St. Louis. Clark as as Indian agent, and Lewis as governor. And part of their responsibilities were to oversee the Indian factory systems. This was a system established in 1795 under Henry Knox to trade goods with Indians at cost to form alliances with them. And you can see that throughout the Cis-Mississippi region between the Appalachian Mountains and the Missouri River, there are a whole number of various factories that were in order. And you'll also notice in the upper right corner that Fort Osage was established in 1808, just 2 years after the Lewis and Clark expedition, and was built by none other than William Clark. Clark surveyed the site for this post, which he noted in his journals as a good site on the Fire Prairie. And within 2 years, there's a federal factory of the United States government there called Fort Osage. At the same time, the factories only existed or operated within 300 miles of so-called European or American towns. So anything beyond that 300 miles was considered beyond the purview of the government regulations. And as such, Manuel Lisa, successful from establishing a fort up in Montana, comes back and organizes the Missouri Fur Company. And guess who his partners are? Meriwether Lewis, William Clark, Governor Lewis's brother Reuben, will all be involved in this private venture on the Upper Missouri. And Clark wrote to his brother saying, "We have 140 men ready to hunt and trap beaver on the Upper Missouri." And so very early on, this seems to be the method that the fur trade is going to be exacted on the Upper and Lower Missouris. Most people consider the Platte River the dividing line between the Upper Missouri and the Lower Missouri. So when I use those phrases, just kind of think about the Platte as the dividing line. So William Clark, Meriwether, and Reuben Lewis, and Clark had the important role of receiving all the peltries, furs, and money delivered to him by the company or a member thereof. You can imagine how some people in St. Louis felt this was a conflict of interest, that not only is he running the factories for the government, but he's also involved in a private fur company, and they're storing the furs sometimes in the same warehouse. And so some people thought there was the potential for commingling, even though there hasn't been a lot of evidence surfaced that there was anything nefarious going on. Well, in 1809, this fur company received an extensive contract to return the Mandan chief and his wife back to their people. And so this $7,000 that the fur company received to take them home was ultimately successful, but unfortunately, it culminated in a series of events that will cost Governor Meriwether Lewis his life. Clark wrote to the Secretary of War, William Eustis, that the difficulties of their company with the Blackfoot Indians and the British establishments in the Upper Missouri compelled the company to abandon the forts on the Yellowstone River and the Three Forks of the Missouri. So the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprised of the three principal tribes of Blackfeet, including the Blackfoot proper, as well as a fourth tribe, the Yatsenas, will be the bane for American fur trade endeavors for the next 30 years. Of course, Lewis had not started things out well with the Blackfeet with his incident on Two Medicine Creek up near Cut Bank, Montana, on their return journey in 1806. There are other private companies that are getting organized as well. In 1808, John Jacob Astor formalized the American Fur Company and received a monopoly to trade. He formed a Pacific Fur Company and sent out William Price Hunt in 1811 to travel overland all the way to the mouth of the Columbia and build a fort very near where Fort Clatsop had been erected. In fact, it's only 6 or 8 miles away from where that fort was. The returning Astorians were led by Robert Stewart, and we'll talk just briefly about them because it sets up some important geographical information for what comprises later in our discussion of the rendezvous. Here's just an image of Fort Astoria. It was eventually sold and taken over by the British, but then after the War of 1812, reverted back to John Jacob Astor's hands because of the Treaty of Ghent and its provisions that no territories could have been gained during the war. Robert Stewart returns from Fort Astoria to St. Louis, and he travels this route from Wyoming. And in particular, I want you to notice that from Pinedale, he heads south, crossing over what becomes known as South Pass. This information of a gentle rise in the southern Rockies or Central Rockies was quite significant because Lewis and Clark had found northern passes through the mountains. Lewis and Clark Pass, Lemhi Pass. But these passes were so far north in Montana and Idaho that they were not suitable for overland migration. South Pass in central Wyoming is going to have 350 to 500,000 people cross it in the next 50 years before the railroad. So this becomes a major geographic discovery. A series of events occur in the 5 years preceding the rendezvous that will set the stage for what's going on internationally. In addition to the treaty with Britain that establishes the 49th parallel to Oregon country and Lake of the Woods, the Spanish also enter into a transcontinental treaty with John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of State to President Monroe. And you can see this line is basically the division between California and Oregon, all the way over to South Pass, down to the Arkansas, then down to the Red River, the dividing line between Oklahoma and Texas, and then down modern Louisiana boundaries. So this sets in play then these two treaties, one between the British and one between the Spanish, that set up a global expansion to in some ways fulfill Jefferson's dream of an empire stretching from sea to shining sea. Moreover, Missouri is going through dramatic changes. In 1820, it petitions for statehood and is brought in, as well as Maine, as two new states of the Union. In that same year, 1821, Mexico achieved her independence from Spain, claiming the line now all the way from Alta California through Baja and down through Mexico proper. All of these changes are going to have dramatic effects because now this new state of Missouri has a new trading partner in the territories of Santa Fe and Taos in New Mexico. Because the Spanish had prevented Americans from traveling into their territory, there was new leadership under Mexico that occasionally welcomed and sometimes hindered Americans from trading. So the Santa Fe Trail opening in 1822 is going to be a major impetus for enterprise from the state of Missouri. Moreover, there's some dramatic changes happening in Canada. The competition between the Northwest Company in Montreal and the Hudson's Bay Company, headquartered in London, had come to blows because of their intense competition, specifically with the explorations that Northwesters had made into the Pacific Northwest. Think of the import of or the significance of the voyages from Montreal to the Pacific by Alexander Mackenzie, a Northwesterner who publishes this book that inspires Jefferson to get involved in the Louisiana Purchase. Or David Thompson, who floats down the Columbia River to establish a post at the mouth of the Columbia River to claim it all for Canada, but he arrives after Fort Astoria has been built. Therefore, the Americans have a justified claim, at least to the southern part of the river. This will bring into question these government trading houses that had been in operation since 1795. Should they be continued, or should the government rely on private traders operating under bonds and under the auspices of the Trade and Intercourse Acts to follow certain rules that the government had in place? And the senator from Missouri, Thomas Hart Benton, pictured here on your left, and the former territorial governor of territorial Missouri, now the superintendent of Indian Affairs, William Clark, were two major players in negotiating this new auspice. Clark had undergone a series of important events in those few years. His wife Julia had died, likely in childbirth with their fifth child, and he eventually marries her cousin, Harriet Radford Kennerly, pictured in the top right corner. Since he did not become governor when Missouri became a state, he was defeated by Alexander McNair. Instead, about a year later, he was appointed the federal Indian agent for all of the tribes west of the Mississippi, the superintendent of Indian Affairs at St. Louis. Meanwhile, things are really bursting in Missouri with lead mining. Now, you're aware that Lewis and Clark took lead canisters filled with powder that they used during their 2.5-year expedition. Lead was the name of the game in terms of armament in the pre-Civil War period. And it just so happened that there were lots of lead mines along the Missouri and Mississippi rivers, and in particular in the mining districts of Missouri Territory. Andrew Henry, who had been with Manuel Lisa, had come out of the mountains after the War of 1812 and had gotten involved in lead mining. Meanwhile, William Ashley had been involved in the production of saltpeter, which you may know is how you create gunpowder. So you've got the powder and lead forming a partnership here, and it was sure to make a bang. When Henry and Ashley joined forces in 1822, Ashley says, "I will be the face of the party here in St. Louis, and you be the field agent. You know the upper Missouri country. You've lived there, you built forts there." And so they're very confident that this partnership is going to go swimmingly. They issue a series of newspaper advertisements, including this one on February 13th, 1822, advertising for enterprising young men, asking for 100 men to become hunters, to go into the mountains to hunt beaver. Now, this was a pretty big change from the fur companies that Manuel Lisa and others had been enacting, where they sent traders upstream to trade with native peoples and native trappers, or to build forts along the river and trade there. This is actually going into the mountains to do their own hunting. And when you look at the list of characters, Kit Carson, Robert Campbell, Jedediah Smith, Jim Beckwourth, Jim Bridger, James Kleiman, all of these characters were pretty significant in what we now call the Rendezvous period. I happen to throw in a couple in the middle. One is my advisor, Fred Gallons, and one with myself in leathers. Those were just for fun. But look at what's happened. By 1822, the newspapers are reporting great activities prevailing in the fur trade, many new firms. 1,000 men are employed in this trade on the Missouri. So things are really cooking in Missouri in 1822. I don't want to belabor all of the different companies, just know there's lots of competition. There's a Missouri Fur Company, a French company, a Columbia Company, an American Fur Company, and of course, Henry and Ashley, which are the ones we're going to focus on the most. Meanwhile, William Clark, superintendent of Indian Affairs, living in St. Louis, is still involved with this trade. He's issuing licenses to anyone who is a business leader who's planning on going to the upper Missouri. You can see this one was for the Upper Missouri for the purchases of engaging in trade with the Mandans, Gros Ventres, and Assiniboines for 1 year. So the people are coming in, they're paying their government bond, they are given a copy of the trade and intercourse laws so they know how to follow, and then they receive this certificate granting them permission to go into Indian country. Henry was the experienced field agent. He travels into the interior with the men, and Ashley is the financier and supplier. Unfortunately, things did not go well. Any of you who have worked with startups know that anything that can go wrong sometimes does. And in this case, the Blackfeet wiped out several of the posts and of the supply ships of this new company. There was another group called Immel and Jones. They were wiped out as well. And so there's some real difficulties in getting this trade established on the river because of native resistance, particularly from the Blackfeet Confederacy. But there is a lot of opportunity, and the types of goods and produce that are taken to be part of the trade are similar things that Lewis and Clark had taken in 1804 to 1806. In 1822, Henry's party arrives at the Arikara Trade Center. You're aware from your reading of the journals and your study of the expedition that the Arikaras and the Mandan Hidatsas had massive trade centers on the upper Missouri River. And the Arikaras in particular, in this year, were willing to trade with Andrew Henry's party. So they acquired as many horses as they needed, and they thought that in the future this kind of partnership would continue. So, with the setbacks, they want to reload, go get some more men, some more supplies, and do it again. So they put another ad in the paper. This time they're going to pay $200 a person per year to go on this expedition. Can imagine that any able-bodied young person in St. Louis is going to be interested in joining this venture for those kinds of wages. They said that these men, it was like going into about their own backyard because of how familiar they became with the geography of the West. You're familiar that Jim Bridger was just an 18-year-old boy when he heads with Andrew's party up the Missouri River. Eventually, he and Hugh Glass will have some interesting stories that have somewhat been Hollywoodized in The Revenant. This time, when the party arrived at the Arikara villages, they thought they were going to trade for horses, and instead the Arikaras said, "You're not going upstream." And they killed a dozen of Ashley's men and prevented them from proceeding any further beyond the Grand River. Well, with this setback, Ashley returned back to the cantonment and talked to Henry Atkinson and said, "We need to get past this native village that won't let us by." And so Henry Atkinson leads a force, and during that fall, we have what's called the Arikara War. Even though there are not very many casualties of the Arikara War, they are able to break the blockade, and Henry and his men get through. Now Ashley and Henry have a decision to make, and this is how the rendezvous system is born. Because of these setbacks on the upper Missouri and the resistance by the Arikaras, Henry and Ashley decide they're going to change the entire way they operate in the fur trade. They send Jedediah Smith and Thomas Fitzpatrick to the Crows overland to salvage the season. And they send another party with Hugh Glass and Jim Bridger to accomplish the same trick. Unfortunately, both of these parties meet with grizzly bears, and you're aware of Hugh Glass being mauled by a grizzly on his expedition through South Dakota. And you may or may not be aware that Jedediah Smith also was attacked by a grizzly bear, which ripped his skull from ear to top. He asked his friend James Kleiman, pictured here on the right, to sew his ear back on. And he sewed it on upside down. I'm just kidding. I wanted to see if you were paying attention. He sewed it on okay, but that part never did heal properly, and so he always wears a comb over in any of the drawings or depictions of Smith. Smith does arrive with Fitzpatrick at the winter encampments of the Crows. The Crow peoples live along the Yellowstone River down through the Bighorn country in southern Montana and northern Wyoming. And they often would spend the winter around hot springs. There was a series of hot springs by modern-day Cody, for instance, and modern-day Thermopolis. Some of these Wyoming towns were where these native peoples spent the wintertime in places that they could go to the hot tub during the winter. And while there, Smith and Fitzpatrick tried to find South Pass in the spring of 1824. But the snows were so deep and it was so cold that they returned to the Crow villages. While there, James Kleiman noted in his journal that the Crows, that he spread out a buffalo robe and covered it with sand and made some heaps to represent the different mountain ranges. And then the Crows told them about the geography of the region. And they finally got this idea that they could cross over a southern pass into the Green River Valley, which they called the Siskiyou, or the Prairie Chicken River. So if you look at a geopolitical map of the United States, sometimes you see this one that has the Oregon country in yellow, the Mexican territory here in pink, Texas in blue, and the Louisiana Purchase in kind of a white cross-hatching. And you can see where all of those countries come together is roughly the 42nd parallel and South Pass. So this becomes a principal area of great significance because it's the center of all of this international contestation for the fur resources of North America. This is an image from South Pass looking east toward Pacific Butte. And here's the view from the top of South Pass looking west. When Jedediah Smith and Fitzpatrick and his crew cross over into the Green River Valley, this becomes the beginnings of what will be the Rocky Mountain Rendezvous Era. Smith leads a party and heads to trap in the north slope of the Uinta Mountains. Some other men trap up the Green River, and eventually they come back and cache their furs on the Sweetwater on the other side of South Pass. And they send word back to Ashley that they have crossed over South Pass, entered into an area where the beaver are plentiful, and the inhabitants are peaceful toward them. These were the Eastern Shoshones. And this is a kind of a culture map of the Shoshonean peoples, the Western Shoshone in Nevada, the Northwestern Shoshone and Sacagawea's people in Idaho, the Eastern Shoshone or Washakie bands in western Wyoming, and then some of the Goshute groups down in Utah. The reason I share this crescent of Shoshonean occupation is because this becomes the centerpiece for the Rendezvous Era and the Mountain Men Era. When we look at Fort Hall or Fort Bridger or all of these forts that were eventually built in this area, Or you look at the rendezvous that were held between 1825 and 1840, almost every one of them are within Shoshone territory. So they almost give a blessing to the Americans to join with them in this endeavor. Osborne Russell, one of the chroniclers of the fur trade, said this: "The Shoshone country comprises all the regions drained by the Green, the Bear, and the Snake rivers. They're kind and hospitable to whites, thankful for favors, indignant at injuries. They're well armed with guns and well supplied with horses." So in just a paragraph, Russell has encapsulated his impression of the Shoshones as pretty good partners. And when you think about it, Lewis and Clark had been at the Arikara and Mandan trading centers, and they had been over at the Dalles for the trading center on the Columbia River. But there were also very significant secondary trading centers that were centered in western Wyoming, in the homeland of the Shoshones, symbolized by that green circle, circled by the blue circle. And it's this region, then, that is going to comprise the main event for the Rocky Mountain Rendezvous period. I put little beavers where all the rendezvous were, and you can see that they're all in Shoshone and Crow territory. And so this fits the same pattern that we were just addressing. In particular, there's a large clumping over here in Cache Valley, along the Bear Lake and Cache Valley areas, and another major clumping up here in modern-day Pinedale, Wyoming, where many of the ones from the 1830s occurred. We also had a few up here in Pierce Hole, and a few over here in the Crow country of the Popoaji. Now, this trading partnership was intensified and cemented through intermarriage. One of my friends, Bill Swaggerty, did a study of all of the intermarriages that he could find records of mountain men and native women. And a majority of those intermarriages occurred between mountain men and Shoshone. So it's no secret that they would be kind of the centerpiece of this trade, because they are the ones who are forming partnerships with those people. And if you're Jim Bridger, for instance, and you want to establish a trading post in Shoshone country, well, one of your wives better be Shoshone. And indeed, he did have a Shoshone wife. Henry and Ashley made 3 inventions or innovations to the existing fur trade. And this is the take-home slide if you're trying to get a grasp of what the rendezvous is all about. From Lewis and Clark until 1824, most of the people are traveling by boats on the river. They're trading at forts with Indian traders and Indian trappers that are coming in to trade for merchandise. Now, all 3 of those are going to be upended by this rendezvous system. Now, instead of boat travel, it'll be overland caravans of horses and mules and carts and wagons. Instead of forts that were expensive to maintain year-round on the river and difficult to resupply, we had a summer rendezvous that was between 1 day and 2 months in duration, depending on the years. And those trappers would bring in their fur haul from the year, exchange them for manufactured goods, and those goods that had been brought in on the horses would be taken by the mountain men for another year in the mountains, and the furs would be hauled back to St. Louis for trade. And Indian traders, which were sometimes capricious and did not always get involved in the capitalistic endeavors that the companies wanted, were replaced by these mountaineers or mountain men. So this rendezvous system then replaced the factory system, which was discontinued in 1822 and is now open to private investment. And we've got river travel being replaced by overland caravans, and forts being replaced by summer rendezvous in the Rocky Mountains, principally in the territories of the Crows and the Shoshones. Now, the rendezvous needed a lot of people to make it work. Sometimes we think about men like Jim Bridger or Jim Beckwourth or Kit Carson because they were the colorful free trappers. And they were the cocks of the walk. They are the ones who were kind of the privileged class of the fur trade beyond the bourgeois. But we also had camp keepers who did the majority of the skinning and tanning and cooking and raising the shelters. There were lots of indigenous women and Métis women and their families that were part of this trade. At the rendezvous in 1825, 1832, participants will say that half of the people at the rendezvous are women and children. So we sometimes don't think about that when we think about, all these men living out in the mountains by themselves. That wasn't really the case. Many of them had native families and children along with them. There were also company trappers. This wasn't as common, but it was more common in the British system of engagés who were affiliated with the company and worked for a wage. And in fact, this is how Henry and Ashley had originally envisioned things when they agreed to pay people like $200 a year to work for the company and to harvest furs for the company. But by the mid-20s and early 30s, people had said, we don't want to work for the company. We want to be our own individual and to make our own decisions. And so this idea of a free trapper emerged. And we also had quite a few indigenous trappers, particularly those that had been employed with the Northwest Company that were Métis or Mohawk or Iroquois of heritage. We also had Shawnees and Delawares, some Crows, some Nez Perce that are all part of this fur trade. So we got to think broader about the bigger picture of how many different nations and groups are involved. We've also have Native Hawaiians. We have French and Spanish and British and Mexican people that are all part of this trade. So it's really an international affair that's part of this rendezvous era. And part of this innovation was to develop a year-round cycle that was determined by the months. So from November to February, the beaver lodges are all frozen. The rivers are all frozen. So the men would live in a winter encampment. They would spend their time trading, preparing food, repairing clothes and traps, spinning yarns, reading Shakespeare, things that Warren A. Ferris eventually called the Rocky Mountain College. He said he learned so much from these fireside chats from his peers. In March, when the ice began to break in the lower elevations, that's when they would start trapping. And they would just follow the streams upriver as they thawed, trapping as they went. And by the summer, they would have a catch, the spring catch, that they could then take to rendezvous. And then at rendezvous, they would receive supplies. This was usually the last week in June or much of July. And you can still go to Pinedale, Wyoming on the second weekend in July and participate in the Green River Rendezvous Days. They hold them every year and see some of the things that were going on in those areas. I invite you and encourage you to do that. Then in September, it's time to get ready for the fall hunt again. As soon as the weather gets colder, the beaver coats start to get thicker. So this time you hunt in reverse. You start at the very highest point of the mountains, you work your way down as things freeze over, and then you eventually arrive back in your winter encampment. So this was really a year-round process that gets pretty firmly established during this 15 years of the fur trade. Well, there was a lot of competition. Even though the Hudson's Bay Company and Northwest Company had merged in 1821, Hudson's Bay was not content, and they began moving down into what became the United States of America. And they sent groups called Snake River Brigades to hunt all of the beaver in Idaho. And their intent was to create a fur desert so that Americans would not trap any of those streams, and it would prevent them from going into the Oregon country. And so these brigades were ruthless in trying to trap every beaver that they came across. And the one that we're going to focus on was the 1824-1825 brigade led by Peter Skeen Ogden. Now, Ogden was at Flathead Post up here in modern-day northern Idaho, up by Flathead Lake on the Clark's Fork, if you're familiar with the Clark's Fork. And one of the things that was disturbing to him is that a group of 5 or 6 Americans showed up, led by a man named Jedediah Smith in the fall of 1824. And in the spring of 25, as Ogden set off on his Snake River Brigade, Smith and his party of American trappers were shadowing them back and forth, sometimes leading, sometimes trailing. And so this was very disconcerting to him that the Americans were horning in on the so-called Hudson's Bay trade. As they headed south, crossing the modern Idaho-Utah border in this map on the right, you can see that Preston and Franklin and Cache Valley locations like Logan, they eventually arrived down here on the Weber River, named after mountain man John Henry Weber. And they're going to have a little altercation in the spring of 1825 that's going to really affect the trade. One of the journal keepers for Ogden was a man named William Kitson. And between Ogden's journal and Kitson's journal, we have a very great record of this journey. And I'll just cover a couple of days. They arrived at a place called a hole. A hole is simply a small valley, usually with a stream running through it, that's surrounded almost entirely by mountains. And he called it his new hole. It's now called Ogden Hole, and it's just across the mountain from modern-day Ogden, Utah. And there in the hole, he says, no sign of Americans. The beaver are numerous. We caught 52 beaver tonight. That's a pretty good catch. The next day, Tuesday, the hole's small. It's only 50 miles in circumference. But we brought in 244 beaver today. What a haul. The next day, Wednesday and Thursday, 109 beaver, 68 beaver. They caught almost 650 beaver in 3 or 4 days. They said, if we hit another hole like this, our trip is an immense success. The people are going to be so happy with us. But as you know, sometimes when things get so good, something bad may be around the corner. And in this case, the Taos trappers and the Americans were both coming to Weber Valley. And they meet. 3 main groups, Jedediah Smith's party, John Henry Weber's party, and the William Ashley party are all on their way to the Shoshone country. And the Smith group and the Weber group meet with Ogden. And this is a place called Deserter Point. It's by Mountain Green, Utah. They're going to have a commemoration this year in May of 2025 to commemorate this event. If you're interested in the details of all those things, just send me an email, jay_buckley@byu.edu, and I'll send you the details of when all these events are going to happen. But what you need to be aware of is that when all of these parties get together, they have a conversation. And in that conversation, the American gardener who led one of the parties of John Weber, says, all that are here are in the United States territory, and we are all free. So he's basically telling all the people with Ogden that they could leave his party if they wanted to come over to the American side. The next day, Gardner says, do you know in whose country you are? Ogden replied, it has not been determined between Great Britain and America, so he's claiming joint occupation. But as you'll notice here on this map, they're down here south of the 42nd parallel, which was technically Mexican territory, more principally Northwest Shoshone or Ute country. And then Gardner left Ogden's tent and went to the Iroquois tent of John Gray. This Mohawk man led the Mohawk and Métis trappers of the Hudson's Bay Company. And Gray said, I must now tell you that all the Iroquois, as well as myself, has long wished to join the Americans. Now we go, and all that Ogden says cannot prevent them. And his rationale was that the longer we remain, the more indebted we become. Basically, what John Gray is telling Ogden is that the company, the Hudson's Bay Company, sells them goods very expensively and pays them for their pelts at the lowest rates. And by charging high prices and paying low wages, they can never get out of debt. Gray has visited with the Americans. He's asking what price they pay. They tell him, and it's almost twice as much as Hudson's Bay. So, of course, all of these trappers are going to defect or desert and join the Americans because they're going to get paid twice as much, and they won't be charged as much for their goods as well. So all the Iroquois get ready in an instant, and they leave Ogden, taking their furs with them. This is known as Deserters' Point, or the defection of the Hudson's Bay Brigade. And when you look at it in real terms, about 30 people deserted along with their wives and children. They brought 700 pelts with them. That's about 1,120 pounds of pelts. At $3 to $3.50 a pound, that's about $4,000, which in New York would bring about $7,000. Ogden lost, in essence, about $181,000 in today's prices in this 1 week. So that was late May. Now, William Ashley had been informed by Thomas Fitzpatrick and James Kleiman that Jedediah Smith had been successful in trapping furs in the Green River Basin, and it was time to bring out supplies. So he's bringing out a caravan to the 1825 rendezvous, which you'll see is right there on the north slope of the Uinta Mountains.
No.
And this is just a close-up. You can see that Uinta County and Sweetwater County are in Wyoming, and Summit County and Daggett County are in Utah. So this is right on the border, on the north slope of the Uintas. And the little beaver that you see on the left is my ranch on a stream that's properly named Beaver Creek. We have West Beaver, Middle Beaver, and East Beaver that all flow through our land into Henry's Fork, which is where this rendezvous is going to be held on July 1st, 1825. And there, where Birch Creek and Henry's Fork come together, you can still go and visit. There's a sign that tells you a little bit about the rendezvous. And since this is the 200th anniversary, as we're commemorating the Green River Rendezvous in Pinedale, Wyoming, we will also have a caravan or auto tour that people can go down and visit this rendezvous site, and we will go down and have a little presentation down there in July of 2025. You can go to the Museum of the Mountain Man, their website, to follow along on any of those events in July of this year. these deserters from Ogden's party are at the rendezvous, and they're pretty excited about the prices that they receive for their pelts.
No.
They also are pretty understanding of the charges that they're given. And it's quite interesting when you look at the record books of this case, because the ledgers that Ashley keeps shows exactly how many each person brought in of beaver, otter, etc., and what things they purchased. Moreover, they also gave a wish list of what they wanted him to bring next year. So their wives are telling them, this is the kind of cloth that we want brought in. These are the kinds of needles and thread. These are the kind of textiles we want. And so in 1826, all of those things are brought in with the supply caravan. So it's fascinating to see the influence that natives still had on the trade, even though sometimes we think it was mostly white men that were part of this trapping brigade. Now, to judge whether or not this first haul was successful, Ashley collected almost 10,000 pounds of beaver, valued in 1825 at roughly $50,000. A modern day value estimation on the income calculator is over $1 million. So you can imagine you could lose your shirt or you could gain a vast fortune in the fur trade. Now the trappers left the rendezvous. They went to their various places for the fall hunt, and then many of them went to a winter encampment up by Cache Valley to spend it with the Shoshones near the Great Salt Lake. And we have really good records of Yellow Hand, who was one of the leaders. He had a large medicine lodge, and he has some remarkable prophecies about the fur trade that came true the following year. They formed a fast friendship and often would winter with them over the next 5 years. They became brothers in more ways than one. Some of them take or negotiate for native wives. There was one incident where a Shoshone had dressed up as an antelope and was killed by one of the mountain men. The mountain men apologized, said they wasn't aware that it was a Shoshone. They smoothed things over, and the man was buried and peace was preserved. Darren Perry, who was the principal chairman of the Northwest Band of Shoshones, corroborated this story with me when I spoke at Ogden Valley a few years ago. We also have pretty good journals from Ashley's 2 treks out to the Rocky Mountains. His first journal in 1824-25 was given to William Sublette and had been translated and transcribed by people who had found it there. About a dozen years ago, we had a new journal emerge of the trek out to the 1826 rendezvous. And we weren't sure initially whether it was Robert Campbell or William Ashley who had kept this journal. I had the good fortune to be able to transcribe this record, and it was published in the Rocky Mountain Fur Trade Journal. We had forensic evidence that identified it 98% as William H. Ashley's record, which he gave to Robert Campbell to keep. So this was a great, wonderful experience for me to have a record that had never been uncovered that revealed so much information about the fur trade, and it also provided the first accounts of all of the overland routes that the Oregon, California trails later utilized. This is the first written record of all of those locations. So this, every year, with people leaving Westport or Independence, Missouri, traveling overland to South Pass and into the rendezvous country, they're at kind of where the Sublette cutoff is noted. You can see that that's the entire eastern half of the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails. Moreover, we had trappers and traders coming down from the Hudson's Bay Company, who, after 1825, are established at Fort Vancouver, just on the opposite shore from Portland. And they're coming down to the rendezvous. This is the western half of the Oregon and California trails. So what I'm trying to tell you is that from 1825 to 1840, the Oregon and California trails were initially called the Great Fur Trade Road. And these were the roads back and forth to the rendezvous. And this is really important. Well, Robert Campbell was the clerk for Jedediah Smith, and he's there at the 1825 rendezvous. Smith had taken over from Henry as a partner to Ashley, and now when Ashley bows out, Smith is ready to increase his partnership as well. And he joins with Davy Jackson and William Sublette with Robert Campbell as clerk. And this forms the company of Smith, Jackson, and Sublette. They operate from 1826 to 1830. Smith is the field partner. He travels and explores all the American West. David Jackson is a capable field agent who leads the brigades. Jackson Hole is named after him. Little Jackson's Hole is named after him as well. And William Sublette becomes the principal financier, supplier, and pretty much go-to guy for whatever they needed. Sublette County, Wyoming, where Pinedale and Big Piney are part of his legacy. Well, in 1826, Jim Beckwourth leaves this description of the rendezvous. He says, the absent parties began to arrive, one after another, shortly after Ashley and Sublette came in, accompanied with 300 pack mules well laden with goods, all the things necessary for mountaineers in the Indian trade. And there was mirth, songs, dancing, shouting, trading, running, jumping, singing, racing, target shooting, yarn telling, frolicking, all sorts of extravagances. So, unlike the first rendezvous that only lasted one day, from 1826 to the 1830s, the rendezvous often spanned several weeks and were much joyous in their events. I won't be talking about every single rendezvous and what occurred there, but I'll just hit just a couple big points as we conclude today. Smith, of course, is the field agent. You can see some of his explorations in 26 and 27 and 28. He's traveling all over through California, Nevada, the Southwest, the Pacific Northeast, as well as into the Rockies. And in 1827 and 1828, the rendezvous were held near Bear Lake in Utah, at the southern end of it. And they're notable in part because not only did a lot of Shoshones and Nez Perce and Flatheads and Crows attend these rendezvous every year, but they also had some native peoples that didn't want them to profit by the trade show up as well, sometimes hitting the rendezvous before it happened, sometimes after the goods had been delivered. And this was the Atsina and Blackfeet Confederacy. You'll notice from this map that they controlled pretty much the region from the Yellowstone National Park area all the way into Alberta. They were a major confederacy controlling the horses and the fur trade of that era. And particularly the Three Forks was one of their principal areas. And so you can understand that just south of that, the Crows and the Shoshones would not be too fond of the Blackfeet. In fact, they had enmity toward them. And as the mountain men intermarried with the Nez Perce, the Pend Oreille, the Kootenai, the Shoshone, the Crows, all the tribes in the round, and the Crees, basically they're marrying all the enemies of the Blackfeet. As a result, whenever you have to guess about a Blackfooted or a Indian attack during the Rendezvous Era, 95% of them are the Blackfeet or Tsenas that are involved in this. In 1827, it's a Blackfeet attack. 1828, it's a Blackfeet attack. And of course, think about the lure of these rendezvous. You've got thousands of horses and mules. You've got all of this equipment that's been brought out, all of these textiles, all these traps, all of these goods that are ripe for the picking. It was just such an irresistible dilemma for them to pass that by. I just wanted to circle back around to those defectors. Remember Ogden's men who joined the Americans? We have promissory notes from some of them that within 5 years, their profits were sufficient that they were able to pay off all their debts to Hudson's Bay. In fact, Peter Skene Ogden was floored when these people came back and paid off their debts to their company. But they'd been so successful in the American system that they were making money every year. This ledger of John Gray, who was at that deserter's point, shows that he's still bringing in money even nearly 10 years after this event. There were also lots of place names that were named after these Métis and Mohawks. John Gray had several places named after him, including Gray's River in Wyoming. Pierre's Hole is named after a Métis or Mohawk man. And in 1832, the rendezvous was held at Pierre's Hole. This thing was massive. There were roughly 2,000 people there, about 300 mountain men and about 1,700 American Indians. And you can imagine the partying and good times that were had during this rendezvous. Everything went perfectly until the rendezvous was over. And then when people were leaving, guess what happened? Yep, the Blackfeet attacked. And there was a massive skirmish with the Blackfeet at the conclusion of the Pierre's Hole rendezvous. And there are epic stories about this attack, which is one of the most famous of all the Rendezvous Era. Jim Hardy, who wrote that article in the November WPO, has written a book about Pierre's Hole that is very good covering this. Well, in 1833, there was another major rendezvous, and this one was in the Green River Valley near Pinedale, Wyoming. And for the next 8 years, 6 of the rendezvous will be held at this location in Horse Creek. Because there was so much forage for the animals and so much grass and so much trees that you could have encampments of 1,000 people or more without incident. And after the Pierre's Hole rendezvous, Jim Bridger had led a party north and they were attacked by Blackfeet. And during that skirmish, he had a 3-inch iron arrow embedded in his back. And at the 1835 rendezvous, he asked Dr. Marcus Whitman if he would remove it. And he had to be very careful because it was right near his spine and he didn't want to be paralyzed. And Whitman was able to get that arrowhead out. After the success of the operation, there were other people that wanted him to remove bullets and arrows from them as well. It's always good to know if the doctor's a good one before you go all in, right, John? In 1836, Marcus does one better, and he brings out his bride, Narcissa Whitman. Interesting to note, when she wanted to become a missionary and head west, one of the provisions that she had to get married. So she and Marcus got married, and then the next day they got in the wagon and headed west. So that's a pretty quick courting, if you ask me. One day. I should mention that all of these missionary wives that arrived at the 1836 rendezvous created quite a stir. And there were some mountain men that later reflected that the good times were over after the white women arrived because they didn't get quite as rowdy as they had previously. We have an amazing map of the fur trade that wasn't published at that time, but was 100 years later, and it's a treasure trove. And we're fortunate to have the original at Brigham Young University in special collections. And you can type Warren Ferris map BYU, and it will take you in, and you can zoom in to this amazing map, one of the only extant maps of this era, and see the 150 places that are unique to this map. You'll see the large lake in the middle is the Great Salt Lake, and the little lake attached to it below is Utah Lake. This is down where I live. But you can also see the lakes up in Yellowstone with Lake Jackson's Lake and Yellowstone Lake. Fortunately, we finally got a painter coming out in 1837. This was Alfred Jacob Miller. He accompanied the nobleman from England, Scotsman William Drummond Stewart. And it's so fortunate that Miller came, because we do have paintings by Carl Bodmer and who are some of the other fur trade artists? Catlin, but most of them are doing their illustrations on the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. Miller's the only one that's attending rendezvous. And so when he draws something, it's pretty cool, because mountaineers today can say, well, how does it fit in with Miller's paintings? Or is it fit in with what he drew? This is his famous painting of the interior of Fort William or Fort Laramie. This was a fort built by Robert Campbell in 1834 and eventually sold to various parties during the 1830s. His wonderful pictures of the Wind River Mountains kind of give you a flavor of this amazing experience with all these native inhabitants and participants in the trade. He painted weddings of a trapper's bride, or the solitary trapping in the river, and also some negotiations that were going on as well. William Drummond Stewart gave a suit of armor to Jim Bridger, and so he even painted him donning his new suit of armor. By 1840, the Rendezvous Era was drawing to a close. Like the 1825 one, this was a relatively short one that only lasted a few days. Of interest to this one were not only had Protestant missionaries come before, but this time a Catholic Jesuit named Pierre de Schmidt came, and he also does a prairie mass on the bluff over the Green River Valley. And there's a monument up there to De Schmidt that you can visit when you go up to Pinedale this July. In addition, Joe Walker had brought his wife and several children, including his pregnant wife, who gave birth along the route, who were on their way to Oregon, one of the first overland migrants to the overland trails. And we typically think of the Oregon Trail beginning in 1841. We could also consider it beginning in 1840 with the Walker family. I know we spent kind of a whirlwind going through these experiences, but I just hope you get a flavor now of the things that transpired that caused this change from rivers to overland caravans, Indians to mountain men, and forts to summer rendezvous, because in 1840 it actually reverts back to what it was before. As the trade in beaver declines and it moves almost entirely to buffalo hides and deer skins, we go back to river transportation, Indian hunters, and fortifications along those rivers as the three principal methods of the hide trade from the 1840s until the 1860s. So it's kind of a whirlwind tour about the Rendezvous Era, but it sets up the overland migration that occurs in the 1840s along these overland routes that had formerly been called the Great Fur Trade Road. And the immigrants themselves were led by mountaineers who had been part of this rendezvous system. And so that's why the Rendezvous Era is kind of from the mid-1820s to 1840. And we're commemorating the first one this July. And we hope that you can join us. I want to dedicate this to my advisor, Fred Gallons, who wrote one of the best books about this. It's called The Rocky Mountain Rendezvous. And he passed away in 2023, and I miss him.